from Stanford Law School. I have worked for the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, United Nations headquarters in New York. I am the co-founder of NBPOL, which is the umbrella organization of GPODs. I'm also the co-director of the Global Policy, Diplomacy and Sustainability Fellowship. Also, as I like to say, I'm also the peon of the GPODs Fellowship, because if you wanted a cup of tea in GPODs, I'd be getting it for you. So I'm everything at GPODs, but mostly a peon. Apart from this, I am also the Assistant Dean of General School of Environment and Sustainability. I am a member of the World Commission on Environmental Law. I am on the advisory board of Global Policy Insights and a bunch of other things. So that's that. I am mostly an environmental philosopher. That's what I like to call myself, even though I am by qualification a lawyer. I also practice in the Supreme Court of India on the side, if I do find the time. So that's about me. At the GPODs, I teach this wonderful course that, as I said, we had curated from across universities, called the Global Common Seminar Series, and we deal with a lot of subjects, including environment policy, climate change risk assessment, climate mitigation, public health, and climate change. All of those things come together within the fellowship. What I've chosen as a topic today is something that I think is a good reminder of where we should start when we're talking about sustainability, because it's the buzzword, it's the cool thing, it's on vogue. Everyone wants to be a part of the sustainability wagon and be a part of an observer at the UNFCCC negotiations and all of that. But it's always nice to take a step back and see what sustainability really is. So that's my endeavor for today. The topic of my lecture or discussion, as I'd rather call it, is economics of the beneficiary pays principle in form of a case study. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. If you do not know the E of economics or the B of beneficiary pays principle, the E of environment or C of case study, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to take you through everything and it's all going to be clear by the end of it. I must also throw out a disclaimer that I am infamous for my lectures not making sense till the last slide, because it's all over the place. But I assure you, and I promise you, if you do stay with me, it'll all come together at the end of the lecture. So that's what I'm going to try and do. And that being said, here we are, economics of the beneficiary pays principle. A couple of suggestions. The more we interact, the better we learn. I'm trying to quote Bentham here. Bentham had said that clash of ideas leads to new ideas. Videos, if you're speaking, especially, it's always better to, speaking with someone instead of looking at the camera and speaking to myself. I want this, even though this is recorded, I want this to be a safe space. So if you have opinions that might be controversial, do voice them. I enjoy them. Everyone does enjoy them. So please do voice such opinions. A few disclaimers. We're going to start from ground zero. I'm not expecting you to be a master's in sustainability when I take this discussion. So I'm going to be starting with the absolute basics and hopefully build up from there. All the views, being a lawyer, my views, they do not represent any of the institutions that I'm a part of or I'm at the board of. And because it's such a big topic, I'm probably going to give you bits and pieces, and hopefully those will quench your thirst for knowing more about sustainability, at least for now. I'm always happy to have a conversation separately as well, as Swasti mentioned. So that being said, oh yes, one more disclaimer. I am a self-proclaimed astrophysics and neuroscience nerd. I read everything under the sun when it comes to astrophysics. I read everything under the sun when it comes to neuroscience. So you will be seeing a lot of those references in my class. Please tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm citing something that is not right. And please also let me know if something goes absolutely over your head, and I'll be happy to talk about it further. So I want to start with, because I mentioned astrophysics, I'm going to start with a quote, and that'll also explain the lecture structure to you. And it's one of my favorite quotes. I'm sure you've read it all. I think it's overly quoted, but it is a beautiful quote. If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you need to first invent the universe. And I think us as policy professionals, especially when you're talking about environmental policy, we jump onto climate change, right? We jump onto renewable resources and, PV cells and solar city case study in the US and all of those things without really understanding what is environment. And I think instead of, jumping onto the apple pie, let's try and reinvent the universe first and understand what environment really is, and then go about understanding how the economics of PV cells work, right? So that's the basics of why I am starting at ground zero. Now, when I was in Geneva, I mentioned I was working for the Economic Commission for Europe, and I did a bit of a private study, personal study that we're still carrying on at NLS, which is where I took up 32 definitions of the term environment. And I tried to see what are the commonalities, what are the most prominent words, and what is the single thread that flows through them, if there is any. And this was, in a nutshell, it's a continuing research, but this is what came out of that research. So 32 countries, legal definitions of the term environment. In descending order of prominence, these are the words that come up in the definition of environment. There are human beings. What is environment constituted of? Human beings, water, air, land, other living creatures, plants, microorganism, property, and their interrelationship, so how they connected with each other, amongst each other. That's the general trend of the definition of environment. And the most prominent, as you can see on your screen, is the term human beings, right? It could be in French, it could be in Spanish, but that is the most common word used in the definition of environment. And there is something weird about this definition, about this case study that I had undertaken. Would anyone find anything weird, anything common, anything that stands out? Would anyone want to take a guess here? Of these terms that I've listed on the screen, any commonality that might stand out? Anything weird that might stand out? Anything that's missing?
Property?
Yes, that's the most common one I get. People argue, why do you have property as a part of environment? And especially when you have land already there. So that's one thing, even though I am going to come to property as a separate issue during this lecture. So I'm going to address that. But that is the most prominent thing that sticks out. Any commonality that you might find here? Any single thread that flows? Prerit, I take your point as well. Property, yes, I understand. All right, so yeah, go ahead.
No, can we say that putting humans on top of this whole chain sort of gives humans too much, like we're giving ourselves too much importance?
I don't know if you've attended any of my public lectures, Bala, but that's exactly my statement, the statement that I was going to make. And that is the commonality, guys. Something that we miss very often when we are accounting for environment is everything that we've included in this definition is not environment because it is environment. It is environment because it helps sustenance of human life. It is what our five senses perceive to be imperative for our sustenance on this planet. And that's one of the most important common factors in the definition of environment. So let us first understand that it is us who have defined environment. It's quite obvious that we would define it according to our perception of environment. But is there something missing? Is there, so when I asked that question, one of the answers that came to me was, why haven't you included noise? Why hasn't noise been included in these definitions? And that's a fair point. Even though the liberal definition of environment now increasingly includes noise in judicial decisions, if not in policy. And we have different policy measures to regulate noise as well. But noise is one. My issue with that construct of environment is that, again, it's very human-centric. And the reason why I say that it's very human-centric and that is a flaw is because humans are incompetent of defining environment. That's what I argue through this dialogue that we have. Now, for example, this was a news piece a couple of years back in, I think, the Telegraph, I'm not sure. But I don't know if any of you have heard of this Psyche 16, which contains metals worth 8,000 quadrillion pounds, and NASA and Elon Musk obviously are going to explore it and probably at a later stage going to mine it as well. And my question is that this environment impact assessment debate that we want to be participating in our everyday life, in which we do participate in our everyday life, which essentially covers a lot of industries, but essentially is for the mining industry. Would that be applicable on this asteroid? It won't be. Why won't it be? Because this asteroid does not fit within our definition of environment. Does it mean that mining should be unregulated in what is not our boundary of environment? I mean, time would tell, but I think that that's a misplaced opinion about the boundaries of environment in the first place. So how do you define environment is a question that should challenge you and challenge all of us, and not subscribe to the legal definitions that we hold so dearly, especially our courts do. So that's one thing that I wanted to throw at you at the very beginning. But if you, and as I said, I want you to understand the construct of environment before we deal with, the hardcore issues of environmental policy. And I will get there, I promise you. As I said, it'll all make sense with the last slide. But till then, just bear with me. Now, apart from this, why have should human beings be at the center of it all? Should they be defining environment to mean what it means to us? Or should there be a challenge to the perceived concept of environment? A good way to answer this question is by putting forth a few questions, which I'm going to put forth to you. Now, guesses are absolutely allowed. I do not expect all of you to know this. I do not expect any of you to know this. But if you had to guess the 5 most prominent elements in the universe, what would they be? I put the periodic table as if it'll help you find the answer, but I don't want to go by probability.
Is it hydrogen?
Hydrogen is 1. I'm looking for the 5.
Helium.
Helium is number 2. That's correct. We have hydrogen, helium.
So lithium can also be said as in the most
Yes,
common 5 element.
you could argue. Actually, it won't come in the most common 5, but it'll come in the most common 10. So, but I'm looking for something that is more obvious. Hydrogen, helium. What else?
Carbon, no?
Exactly, carbon. 2 more, guys. Any random guesses? I'm sure the most common guesses would be, oh, sorry, yes, oxygen, Rohan, Ramesh, that's correct. Oxygen is the 4th one. We're all missing one prominent element. Anyway, that's besides the point. I wanted to make a point that I'll make with my second question. So up till now, we have hydrogen, helium, oxygen, carbon. The 5th one is nitrogen. Okay, so we have these 5. Exactly, Soumya, it's nitrogen. Now, helium is an inert gas. Let's keep that aside. If you had to guess the 4 most common elements that human body is made up of.
Carbon.
Yes. There's a reason why I'm asking this question right after the last one.
Hydrogen, oxygen.
Yeah. So it is hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen. Those are the 4 most common elements that human beings are made of. So that being said, why am I taking you through the scientific exercise that's absolutely futile and a waste of our time, or so you think for now? It is because human beings are, as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, we're just stardust sprinkle around the universe. And we're just minuscule portions of this grand scheme of things. A very big portion of it is environment, which we have failed to define properly. And a very minuscule portion of it is human species. So I argue that even to attempt to define something that has always been there before us and will probably forever be there till our planet survives is an exercise in futility, but one we must undertake. And if that hasn't been clear enough that we are but minuscule portions of environment and universe that we have failed to define. Let me also put another question to you, just to jog your guessing game, if I may. So if this is a football field on your screen, and this is the entire timeline of planet Earth, how long do you think have human beings been here? So if we take,
Sir,
sorry?
sir, yes, sir. So I read a quote. Once like that. If the entire Earth history could be crammed in 24 hours,
Yeah.
then the human beings appear just 2 minutes before the midnight. Something.
Yes, that's
So,
exactly right.
That
That's actually exactly right. But Uday, the issue with that quote is that everyone's read it. So I wanted to give you guys something different. And that's why I have put this football field example. It makes you think a little more. That's all. Also, please don't call me sir. I'm barely a couple of decades older than you guys. The goal line on the right is what Ramesh says. If you're taking this as the starting point, you're saying this is where human beings are. Actually, I'm not sure what the goal line is, guys. Is it this or that or this? Is it the goal post? All right, okay. So Ramesh says it's the goal post. Some other guesses, any other guesses? Maybe half line, maybe the D, that's what we called it. All right, it's the goal post then. Okay, so you are absolutely right. Human beings have been on this planet equivalent to the width of a single plate of grass, which is 1/16 of an inch on an average, which means that environment, which is pre-existed for equivalent to a football field, is being tried, we're trying to define it having been here for 1/16 of an inch on that timeline of the planet. So the point I'm trying to make here is any effort that we make towards defining environment is going to be puerile, incompetent, incomplete, because of the way we are structured on this planet and the timeline on which we occur on this planet. But as you guys must have studied already, every policy starts with that one golden term, the definition of what you're trying to derive policy of. So let's establish that humans have defined environment and they have begrudgingly defined it to suit their own needs, one might argue. But what about the philosophies that have turned us towards policy through this journey that we undertake towards sustainability? Now, there are a lot of environmental philosophies. There's ecocentrism, there's the Gaia hypothesis, there is ecofeminism, which is a very upcoming branch as well, especially after the Greta phenomena. So there are a lot of these philosophies that are prominent, but I just want to touch upon the most pertinent, because we have established that human beings are at the center of it all. And human beings being at the center of it all is quite literally the name of this environmental ethics approach or environmental philosophy, which is anthropocentrism. Now, all of you have heard of this. Anthro means human, centric means being at the center of it. So anthropocentric is humans are at the center of it. The idea behind this anthropocentric approach is that everything around us, but for human beings, is for our exploitation, right? So everything else is a resource except for human beings. So you can go about exploiting it, you can go about using it for your own good, and eventually it'll all pass. And that's the whole idea behind anthropocentrism. All of us claim to be non-anthropocentric people. We claim to be biocentrists and ecocentrists, and we care for the environment, and we have 2 pets whom we love, hence we are ecocentrists. But that's not how it works. Or you think that you can segregate your waste so you're very environmentally friendly. That's not how it works. Because every action of ours is ultimately anthropocentric. And there's a case which I'm happy to discuss separately for anthropocentrism towards environmental conservation, but we do not have the time to discuss that today. So I'll just move ahead with how anthropocentrism has played out in real life. The third set of my question to all of you is, guess where and when this is. If you could guess the place, if you could guess the decade.
60s.
It is the 60s. Actually, the first time anyone has been able to guess in the first go. Not bad. Location. New York Times Square. No, that's not New York Times Square. Even though I can understand why you think so. New York does not have a single road that's that wide, by the way. I don't think there is. Any other guesses?
Is it the States? The United States?
It is the States, yes.
It's the States for sure because there's a board for Pan Am
Yeah,
Airlines.
exactly.
Yeah.
That was the only hint I'd put there. It is in Boston. Okay, let's give you a hint. It's on the West Coast.
Is this LA?
It is LA. So LA from the 1960s. And I don't know if any of you have seen these photos or have heard of the great LA smog of the 1960s. But what we see in Delhi today, what we see in Beijing today actually happened with LA and actually a lot earlier to London at the turn of the century, 19th, 18th century, 19th century. So basically what happens is LA is going through this wonderful, I'm sorry, not wonderful, this absolutely awful smog situation in the 1960s. They have to wear masks, these horrendous masks, at least ours are a lot more fashionable today. They have to wear these masks. Their kids are born with eczema, emphysema, asthma, every disease that's difficult to pronounce for a non-native English speaker. They cannot see beyond 3 meters because the visibility is so low in LA. And that's the tipping point. So whenever you undertake conversations in an environmental policy forum or in environmental academia, as I do very often, 1960s to 70s is seen as this golden age of environmental policy. You know, the US came up with so many environmental policies. The Clean Air Act came about. Stockholm Conference was pushed for in 1972. Even technological innovation, catalytic converters, exhaust pipes, all of those interventions took place in the 1970s, right? And policy interventions such as states, the federal law said that the states could have higher standards than the ones prescribed by the federal law. So it gave a lot of leeway to environment. It gave a lot of moving space to environment in terms of policy and technological interventions. So this is seen as the golden age of environmental policy, environmental technology. But if you think about it, all of this happened because our kids were being born with eczema and emphysema and so on. We could not see beyond 3 meters. We had to wear these horrendous masks. If that was the reason for all of this to happen, then that means that the greatest achievements in environmental policy happen on the back of innately, inherently anthropocentric behavior. If we could see beyond 3 meters, and if the lives of our kids were not jeopardized by the environmental situation, then we probably would not have stumbled upon these policy innovations or technological innovations. So one thing that we need to understand is distress has been one of the most prominent factors towards moving towards environmental policy. And that is now being replicated in today's times. Distress in relation to climate change is seeing us do these various interventions at the international relations level, at diplomacy level, at public policy level, within the country, internationally, and so on and so forth. So distress is what pushed a human-centric approach, an anthropocentric approach towards policy interventions, technological interventions. But that's not the point I'm trying to make here, because if you remember, the topic of this discussion is the economics of beneficiary pays principle. If you had to, and all of us already know this, you guys are students of public policy, so you would know this. Every policy comes at a cost, right? If every policy comes at a cost, that means that 1970s policies that did come about cost these people in your frame a lot. The question then is, if they had to pay for those technological interventions and those policy interventions, were they the actors? Were they the cause of this pollution? They suffered the consequences for sure, but this sort of smog does not happen within a generation, right? So that means that there were ancestors and forefathers who had polluted, but the cost was borne by this generation. So one of the most prominent arguments in the international level, international relations, international negotiations, and I'm sure all of you have heard of this, is that the previous generations should pay for what they've done to environment. If you look at any international agreement, even Paris Climate Agreement for that matter, or the Convention on Biodiversity, or the division of Global North or Global South, it is all cruxed upon the idea that our ancestors polluted and hence the developed nations should pay the developing nations. So the question is, if it wasn't the generation living through 60s and 70s that was to be blamed for the LA, should they have paid for it? And if they should not have paid for it, who should have paid for it? And that gets us to the principle of beneficiary pays. In real life, how does this work out? We've all probably heard of the 1992 Rio Declaration Earth Summit. If you haven't read it recently, you've probably heard it in school and maybe in civics, I don't know. I mean, like, again, I graduated too many years back to know where you study this. But Principle 7 of Rio Declaration, on which is pivoted the UNFCCC, from where Paris Climate Agreement, or all of these things come about. Principle 7 talks of this very, very curious thing, which is the common but differentiated responsibility. And that CBDR principle basically says that the global north, I'm simplifying it, the global north was culpable in terms of the pollution that we face today. And hence, in terms of its capacity, it should make resources available for the global south to cope with climate action, climate change. So that's CBDR in a nutshell. And it's important to know CBDR because if you speak with anyone at the international negotiation table, and you do that a lot when you're associated with GPODs, you know that common but differentiated responsibility is the biggest issue. What was China's argument against Paris? What was India's arguments against Paris Climate Agreement? That why should we have to suffer or put curbs when you were the ones who polluted majorly, right? So it all comes down to the division of global north and global south and how they were culpable and how they should be made to pay for it and we should not be made to suffer for it and so on and so forth. So that's the backward looking approach, and that essentially is the beneficiary pays principle. Because you benefited from it, you should pay for it. You know, it shouldn't be the people on your screens in that slide who should have paid for it. It should have been the people who caused that pollution. Now, this is all hunky-dory when you're thinking that I have a cousin staying in London and he'll have to pay for it, so haha to him. But that's not, let's humanize this for a minute. What beneficiary pays principle is basically saying is that your cousin staying in London or your friend staying in London should pay an X amount, let's say $100 to my country because he was born in a country that benefited from causing pollution during industrial revolution, right? So when you are putting such a thought across, a lot of like-minded people like myself would say that, listen, it wasn't this friend of mine's fault that their country did what they did, right? So why should they have to pay for anything? They had no control over their actions, the actions of their ancestors. Now, obviously, there will be two views to this. Now, the two views are, one is the conservative communitarian view, the other is the axiological individualistic view. And we have a lot of philosophers. I would not go through all of their theories, but I'll try and cover this in a nutshell here. So the communitarian view or the conservative view says, which is what Edmund Burke and Eric Neumayer and Alex, actually that's Axel Glossaries, guys. If you're Googling him at some point, it's a typo on the screen. These people said that, listen, you have eventually, by virtue of being born in this city of London or city of New York, the developed countries, you know, Paris, Madrid, wherever, you are actually using the benefits that accrued to you for the acts that were committed by your forefathers. So your standard of living is because of the acts of pollution, exploited, benefits of which derived, because of which you have this standard of living. Now, if you think it difficult to assume that how does this play out in real life, imagine that there's an identical NLSIU in London, and there's an identical MPP program in London, and there's an identical Shubham Prakash in London, who has an identical IQ as Shubham Prakash in this class, who has an identical knowledge of all the subjects that Shubham has here. What will be the only difference between Shubham of India and Shubham of London? It will be the standard of living. You know, Shubham might be very well off here. Still, the basic necessities, everything aside, would be better available in London as compared to anywhere in India. So the question is, why is there a difference of opportunity and benefits between Shubham of India, who has the same IQ, who has the same knowledge, who has the same qualification, same institution, as compared to the Shubham, the hypothetical Shubham of London? And that is, as is argued by Edmund Burke and Eric Newmer and Axel Groceries, because of the benefits that were accrued by the pollution, by the environmental disasters that were caused 250 years back by your forefathers, ancestors, so on and so forth. And hence, you should pay. That Shubham of London should pay this Shubham of India an amount in the form of repair, and it would not be to Shubham directly, obviously to India or to the global south. There are various underpinnings to this argument. There's one which says that nationhood does not stop at your death. If you die as an Indian citizen, you will always remain an Indian citizen. So nationhood is more fluid than actual citizens of that nation, and hence crimes committed by that nation, the penalties should continue further, right? And you take the examples of Swiss and German banks that still have to pay debt for what happened before the Second World War. Then there's the standard of living principle, that you have a higher standard of living, the example that I just took. Axel Groceries has a very weird view to this, and it's a very interesting view. He says that no one should be a free rider. It's like, you know, having a roommate who does not pay rent, right? He is availing of all the opportunities, all the benefits of staying in your flat, but he does not pay the rent, and hence he should be chucked out, or he should pay the rent. That's Axel Groceries. Simon Caney, and I invite you to go through Simon Caney's articles, has a very, very axiological view to this. He's a professor at Oxford, Simon Caney, and he says that the maximum you can do is blame the polluter. You can probably blame the pollution. But just because I am indirectly related to an ancestor over whose functions and actions I had no control, you cannot hold me liable, right? Abhishek, did you have something to add there?
No, I'm sorry. The net issue.
All right, no issues, no issues. So Simon Caney takes the exactly opposite view, where he says that you cannot blame someone who had absolutely no connection to all of this, right? I had no control over them plundering the environment. And for all you know, I'm probably not even benefiting from it. Just because I was born in a certain city around the world does not mean that I have to pay for being born this way. And there's a very, very interesting principle of the non-identity. I don't know if any of you are interested in population ethics or population philosophy, but I'm happy to discuss this separately. We just don't have the time to go into it today. But non-identity principle basically says that you cannot agitate against a forest that was cut in the 1920s. Because if, for example, if that forest wasn't cut, the railways wouldn't have happened. Maybe your parents wouldn't have met. Maybe you wouldn't have born. You wouldn't have been born. Which means that you are a consequence of various chaotic factors that have taken place over the years. And you are a result of all of those chaotic factors coming together in a situation which gave rise to you. So you are actually a product of everything bad that has happened that you're agitating against. And hence, you have no voice to raise against what has happened in the past. And that's the principle of non-identity in a nutshell. So why are we talking about who has to bear the price of all of this, all of that is happening around us? Because if, for example, I put two questions to you, should the beneficiaries have to pay even if they did not have to pay a part in the pollution? I'm assuming most of you would say that that friend of mine in London did not do anything, so he should not be made to pay, or she should not be made to pay, right? I'm assuming most of you would take that. Now imagine that you might also argue that beneficiary pays principle looks like a very philosophical principle. I don't see how this can be implemented in real life, but that's not true, because whether you admit it or not, and no matter how environmentally conscious you claim yourselves to be, you are yesterday's polluters for your next generation. So at some point of time, they are going to become the beneficiaries of all the pollution that you're causing, which means that they will have to be held liable for your actions of today. So beneficiary pays principle is actually playing out as we speak. It's just that we confuse it with other concepts of environmental principles and policies, such as precautionary principle and polluter pays principle. And sometimes, for our lack of knowledge on the principle, we just relegate it to the back. But that's not the case. Beneficiary pays principle, arguably internationally, is the most prominent, important topic that you should know of. As I said, you reverse it and your future generations become the beneficiaries, and you become that generation that polluted the most. And by all statistics, 85% of all contributions to our climate disasters have been since the World War II. So it is my generation and yours that has caused most pollution, and probably a generation above us. But if you take all of these morality questions aside, that who should pay and should that person be held liable, and nationhood and free riding and standard of living, if you take morality out of this, what is the one issue that everyone has with paying? It is money. If global North had enough money to spare, they'd happily give it to global South. If global South had the money, they wouldn't care for global North, so on and so forth. There wouldn't be any global North and global South if that were the case. So eventually what it boils down to, at least in the current regimes around the world, is environment becomes a function of economics. It becomes a function of money. And that is why it is the economics of beneficiary-based principle, economics of environment, that we need to understand, even if it's in bits and pieces, to wrap our heads around what is happening in life. So if it is all about economics, why don't we do one thing? As a thought experiment, why don't we have a water act that does not permit emissions into the rivers, and for undertaking any activity, you have to first take the permission of the Pollution Control Board? Or why don't we have an air act where you have to take permissions from the Pollution Control Board to carry on any activity where you're not allowed to pollute beyond a certain limit? Why don't we have a legislation by way of a notification that can assess the impact of every decision that a private player undertakes, and then allow it or disallow it depending on the environmental harm it causes? Why don't we just do all of this, put all of our money in it, and conserve environment? Why do we have to go into all of these things? Why do we have to care for economics when we can have such stringent laws? Well, the reason is that we already have those laws. We have the Water Protection Act that does exactly that. We have the Air Protection Act that does exactly that. We have the EIA Impact Assessment Notification that does exactly that. We have the Environment Protection Act that does exactly that. We have the NGT Act that does exactly. So we have, a bucket full of legislations that do exactly that. They preserve the environment. What is the missing piece then? If it is money, why is it so? Well, let me do a bit of a Yuval Noah Harari-esque recapitulation of everything that is happened to us over time. But before I do that, I want to now disconnect you from the discussion that we've had, connect you to something else, and then hopefully by the end of it, reconnect the 2 points, 2 lines. I find it very aesthetically pleasing to go to Manhattan, go to London, and look at these wonderful skyscrapers. I think all of us do appreciate the skyline of Manhattan at some point of time, or Boston or Chicago, wherever you like. Singapore or Hong Kong or whatever. Now, I wanted to take this as an example of a case study that we are undertaking at NVPOL, where we are looking at the impact of glass skyscrapers. And you might think that, actually, let me come back to that. So this is a building called the Walkie Talkie. If any of you have been to London, you've probably seen this. It's a horrendous looking building. I was actually surprised to know that it was the costliest real estate at one point of time. But it was the costliest real estate because, you know, it's in prime location and it's a glass skyscrapers and people pay a lot to be in the Walkie Talkie or the Bullet. All of these, those of you who watch Sherlock have also probably seen this before. So we pay a lot of money to get a place in these commercial space in these glass skyscrapers. Why do we do that? Why do we do that when it has impacts such as these? And I find this quote to be very funny. Martin Lindsay, the owner of the Jaguar XJ that was melted because it was parked in the parking lot of this walkie-talkie building, said it's absolutely ruined. So now just imagine if a glass skyscraper can reflect the kind of sunlight that can melt a car. Remember that it's absorbing more sunlight than it is reflecting, which means that the amount of air conditioning you require to just function in that glass skyscraper is absolutely through the roof. So while something is so aesthetically pleasing, while it is something that is absolutely disconnected to environment, when you look at it, you look at a glass skyscraper and the last thing you think of is its environmental impact. It has a tremendous environmental impact, and that environmental impact is often not accounted for when you're looking at the aesthetics of it or the architecture of it or the design of it. And you have these buildings have extremely high carbon footprint as well, because just the amount of air conditioning that is required to cool the building down from within is very high. But why have these skyscrapers in the first place? That is because, you know, the Yuval Noah Harari-esque explanation to it is that, you know, human beings gathered, employment happened, people started flocking to cities. When people started flocking to cities, properties prices rose, the value of property rose. They started, you know, constructing one atop another, and that's how these buildings started gaining in heights. But is there a regulation that stops people from going over and beyond a certain height? Yes, exactly. Water pipes would also need. In fact, there's a lot of repercussions, and I've only covered the air conditioning of it because, you know, that's a separate discussion altogether, Bala. But I just want to touch upon something, and the dots that I'm trying to connect here are a policy, because all of you are policy practitioners. That's on your screen, an FSI policy, which is a basic land regulation policy, something that all of you will come across in your life. It is not even tangentially related to environment, right? And what I'm doing in the next few slides, and I promise I would not go beyond 15 minutes, 20 minutes at the max, how everything is related to environment and beyond. So for those of you who do not know what FSI and BCR are, I'll quickly explain this to you. So let's say you have a 1 square meter plot, right? This is your plot, hypothetical 1 square meter. And you have an FSI or an FAR of 2. That essentially means you can construct 2 square meters worth of space in that 1 square meter plot. Okay, so you could either do it this way, you know, two stories of 1 square meter, or you could do it this way, 4 stories of half square meter, or you could do it this way, 8 stories of 0.25 square meter. And that's basically FAR. How much can you construct over your land? BCR is something similar. So how much you leave open is the BCR. It's quite simple actually. Now, why are we talking about BCR and FSI when we're dealing with economics of beneficiary based principle or economics of environment? Because that's the point I want to make here. Things that seem seemingly disconnected to sustainability, environment, things we do not value in our calculations actually have major ripple effects, and every policy that you are working on will have environmental impact. And this is why this is just a case study that I want to bring forth to your notice. This is the vertical growth map of India. I want you to focus on this bit. The Mumbai island, if I'm sure all of us have been there, has an FAR of 1.33, which means if you have 1 square meter of area, you can build 1.33 square meters of built-up area on it, constructed area. Why is this staggering? Well, it is staggering because if you look at the prominent cities in the world, Mumbai is actually the lowest as compared to cities of comparable per capita, comparable population. You look at Hong Kong, you look at Chicago, New York, Singapore, actually I could not even fit into my slide. So Mumbai has an FAR of 1.3. And FAR was decided as a policy. Why was FAR kept at 1.3, you might ask? It was kept at 1.3 because it's a small island city, the main island of Bombay. Because of which, if you have 50 stories buildings everywhere, the land, the natural resources would not be able to make up for the needs of the society, of the population there. Let alone the natural resources, the city of Bombay would not be able to deal with the waste that is generated in that single piece of island. So that's the reason why it's been kept at 1.3. So it's not a thoughtless policy that they put in place, but they did not consider the environmental underpinnings of that policy. But before I move into the environmental underpinnings and the last leg of my talk, I just wanted to bring a couple of things to your notice here. 1.3 is the FAR of the main island city of Bombay. I'm putting a couple of numbers on the screen and tell me if you're able to guess what these numbers are. Would anyone know what 58 square feet might be in the context of Mumbai?
An average apartment?
Close, close. Anyone else? Okay. So let me just, 48 square feet is actually the average space per human being in the island city of Bombay. That's a little less than 7 feet by 7 feet for those of you who want to do that calculation. 48 square feet is the average space available to a resident of Bombay, the main island city. 50 square feet in the US is federally required floor space area of a prison cell. So that should give you an idea of how we are placed in our policies against, prisons of the West. So as I said, average floor space per person in Mumbai versus average floor space of a prison cell in the US, a requirement at least. When you have lesser floor space and you have such employment opportunities, the rents would obviously go through the roof, as I'm sure some of us have suffered. I have worked in Bombay. I know that it costs a lot. When the rents go up, people look for other alternatives. Some people are just not able to afford it. So what happens? Slums happen, right? Dharavi is a prime example. But some of us who do not want to stay in slums and probably can do fit into the middle income group, we would go to a Thane, right? Go to a suburban sprawl. But when you do go to a Thane, the next point is, how do I do up and down, back and forth from the main city? You'd require transportation, right? So a simple regulatory policy that was on the height of a building has environmental impacts such as slums, suburban sprawl, transportation. Now, slums, and I'm not going to go into the details of this, but slums are known for, dismal public health facilities, hygiene facilities. Maybe in some cases, primary education suffers. All of these are impacts that can be liquidated and you can put a dollar figure to it eventually. All right, education was lacking, public health infrastructure suffered so much, environment suffered so much, plastic waste is so much, municipal waste is so much, this is how much the municipality has to spend every year, so on and so forth. You come up with a number that is the total environment impact because of the FSI policy that is tangentially unrelated to environment. The second example is what we saw in the news a couple of months back, maybe last year. RA forests were the big deal because sometimes we fail to consider that suburban sprawls do not come out of nowhere. They were either agricultural lands fitting into the ecosystem of forests, fitting into the ecosystem, and so on and so forth. So for those of you who were not well versed with this, the RA forest was being cut to prepare it for the Metro 3 project of Bombay that could connect it to its suburban sprawl, the main city. And those are environmental impacts. And it's not just this. When you do have urban centers are actually very, very harmful themselves for environment. You know, the kind of energy they consume, the kind of waste they produce, all of these are outcomes that you did not account for when you were coming out with the land regulation policy. If you did account for them, that's also only a part of the puzzle, which I'll come to. But thirdly, as I said, when you do have these suburbs, you have to provide for transportation. All of us do know that transportation have direct impacts, they have indirect impacts, they also have cumulative impacts. So up till now, you might argue that, listen, if I was framing the FSI policy for Bombay, I anyway would have taken these things into account. I would have taken the dollar value of all of this, put it into account, see how we could have managed the pros and cons of such a policy. And if you were the policymaker, I hope that you did take these things into account, but I assure you something that you did not take into account as outcomes of your FSI policy. And that's why the point of this talk is that every policy has a sustainability ripple effect. What you did not take into account are the unliquidated values. Now, I'm going to take you through two studies really quickly. Two studies that were conducted in the US. And for those of you who are indoor chess players, one's for you. For those of you who prefer outdoor sports, the other one's for you. There was a study conducted where impact of indoor climate on human cognition was studied. And the paper studied the impact of environment quality on the performance of individuals undertaking cognitively demanding tasks under time pressure. So the idea was to see how cognitive abilities are affected when you're extremely focused and cognitively engaged under a time pressure. That was the idea behind the study. What was the result of the study? The results, and what they did was they basically tracked chess games across indoor pollution levels in the US. The results consistently indicated pollution harms the player's performance in cognitive tasks. The estimation results show that a 10 microgram increase plus per cubic meter, that's minuscule, almost non-existent, increase in PM 2.5 results in a 1.5 percentage point increase in the probability of a player making a meaningful error with 10% larger errors. That's your propensity to make a mistake goes up by 10% if you're sitting in a polluted room. So a chess player might think that he's made a stupid mistake and he has himself to blame for it. He just lost the world title. Little did he know that it was all because of the FSI policy that his neighborhood had actually imposed on him 6 years back in its master development plan or whatever. But that's not it. As I said, there's also an outdoor example, because you might think that to hell with the chess players, I don't play chess, I play Sudoku or whatever. A similar study was conducted in terms of baseball umpires. And this study, similarly, concentrated on a group of highly skilled, quality-focused employees. And what it showed was that a 1 parts per million increase in a 3-hour carbon monoxide atmosphere causes an 11.5% increase in the propensity of umpires, making errors, incorrect calls, and a 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in 12-hour period causes a 2.6% increase. So your propensity to make mistakes, cognitive mistakes, goes up by almost 10% on an average. And that is why, not directly only because of, I'll just come to your question, Abhishek, not directly only because of the pollution that is because of the FSI. It's obviously an ambient air quality issue, but a big part of it is to be played by your land regulation policy as well, by your FSI as well. So that's the other thing that I'd like to address here, that there are too many pieces to this policy puzzle of environment, and there will always be. That's why I started with the very definition of environment. We haven't really figured out what the definition of environment is. We're talking about property because some people question property as a significant factor of environment. And people argue that it shouldn't be because we already have land and property is a man-made, as was written in one of the comments, construct. But property regulation is a very, very big factor on environment. Now, you might still argue that, all right, I understand that you can put a dollar figure for slums, for transportation, for suburbs. I can also understand that maybe cognitive tasks are affected of chess players or baseball umpires. How does it matter to me? And what does it have to do with the economics of what I do, right? Well, you just have to extrapolate this, because remember, the subjects of those two studies were people who were highly focused, cognitively engaged, and working under time pressure. Think of examples. Think of a stock market broker, right? Think of an air traffic controller, think of a surgeon or miner. Now, in terms of a stock market broker, he's under a lot of stress. He's to be very time sensitive. He's sitting in a room which has high indoor pollution. He makes a mistake, the company's stocks crash, or his client faces losses. Who is to be blamed for that mistake? Is it that stock market broker or the company that is running him, or is it the client? Similarly, air traffic controller. I don't know if you guys have watched Breaking Bad, but that could be an example as well. But I won't talk about surgeons, and it could be because I come from a family of doctors as well. Medical negligence is the buzzword in our circles, at least in legal circles. It's where the big money is, right? A surgeon is cognitively engaged, focused. There's a lot of time pressure. You have the body ripped open in front of you. I know some of us are frightful of the image of blood, and then to have that sort of a scene in front of us. And you have to make calls right there and then. And because of the indoor pollution, because of pollution generally, a pollution that could be accounted for because of the FSI in the Mumbai city, you make a mistake. The patient sues you for medical negligence. You are to pay 50 lakh rupees. Should you be liable to pay those 50 lakhs? Should the government be liable to pay those 50 lakhs because they made that policy that increased the pollution, because of which I made that mistake? So these are the valuation challenges of economics that we do not take into account when you want to study the ripple effect of a single policy that is absolutely disconnected with that. And that's why I said it is too large a topic to cover everything under the sun. But I just want to leave all of you with the thought that it is all around us. And the more we figure out how it could have this cascading effect, the better it is for the surgeons in the house and everyone around us. Probably it'll save a couple of lives. So I have a couple of more slides, guys, but I have run out of time. So I'll just stop at that. And yeah, open to discussion, open to have a conversation about this, open to accept any critique that you might have, observations, statements, questions, anything. Sorry, there are a couple of statements in the chat as well. I'll just open those. Yes, students giving exams. That's probably just I mean, the grand scheme of things, that comes a little low, but yes, that too. That could be one, and that's why I think Vishwanath and Anand also moved to Norway so that there are less errors. But you know, they do have to travel around to play these games. Anyway, I do understand that a lot of my talks generally have a lot of elements of philosophy, and that's because of my personal inclination towards philosophy. And I'm happy to circulate any studies or articles that you might be interested in. I would also want you to look at the non-identity principle whenever you have the time. It's something that has kept me up at night. It is something that I enjoy, and I must admit, something that I haven't completely understood. So I'm happy to circulate some of those as well. Yes, Abhishek.
Hi, Ishan. So I asked this question in the chat also. So when you're talking about like suburban sprawl happening and a larger number of forests or agricultural land being cut down, so does this mean you're probably advocating for higher average height of buildings, or does it mean that there has to be a larger number of urban centers across states so as to cater to the economic outflow from other states?
Exactly. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to touch upon just to be fair to everyone in the audience here. One is, your question is exactly on point. That why don't we just increase the heights of the buildings? Isn't that the solution? Let's take Bombay is a low-hanging fruit. Let's not go there. Let's take Singapore as an example, or let's stick to Bombay because I've taken that as the case study. Bombay, the main island city, which is what we were discussing, the 1.33 FAR island city, is a small piece of land, okay? And to have a civilization on a small piece of land means that you utilize a lot more energy resources, natural resources for subsistence of that population on that small piece of land. The more population you increase, the more is the lesser is the bandwidth of the natural capital of that area. So that's why I'm not even taking the example of the electricity grids that have to be put in, you know, the high tension lines that have to be put in. All of that is aside, infrastructure that is required for waste disposal. I'm just talking in terms of the waste that is generated in Bombay. Even today is unmanageable for by any stretch of imagination. I'm sure you've read articles of how it is disposed of directly into the Arabian Sea. So it is actually impossible to have a higher FAR. So your argument would be that on the one hand, I'm saying that lower FAR is actually bad for environment. On the other hand, I'm saying that higher FAR is bad for the environment. So what's the solution here? The solution is actually what you suggested as your second option. Ultimately, it has to be a decentralized state, province, district, whatever you may. What Delhi, and I do not credit Delhi for much lately, but what Delhi has done really well is it has established, or you know, I don't know if it has, but Gurgaon and to a certain extent Noida have been established as prominent centers. So unless you're, you know, South Delhi boy or a girl, you don't mind staying in Gurgaon, right? And that hasn't happened very often. The idea is to offload your waste, offload your opportunities to another part of your region. And that's why, I mean, like, it is bewildering to see that Bharatpur and Sonipat are in the national capital region. And you might think that it's we're recording, I cannot use the terms that come to mind, but it's a joke, right? That Bharatpur and Sonipat are a part of national capital region. But there's a reason why they are a part of NCR. It is because you want to offload the natural restraint that is put on your environment. And if you want to look at case studies, you should see what Sweden is doing. Stockholm, in parts, charges its toll tax on the basis of wind speed. So if the wind speed is high, the toll tax is low, because if the wind speed is high, it blows away the pollution. So you're encouraged to drive. You can drive cars. If the wind speed is low, the air is stagnant. Hence, the toll tax becomes higher, and hence you're deterred from taking your cars out. So there is a lot to be playing around with policies when it comes to pollution. It's just that it's an interesting phenomena to see. Prerit, did you have something to say? Okay. Anyone else? Any questions or statements? Any observations?
Sir, I actually had a statement when you said that Delhi is trying to offload its waste towards Gurgaon and Noida.
Yeah.
The same is being done by these cities by trying to offload their waste towards, like Gurgaon is kind of like developing towards Rewari, Noida
Yeah,
is expanding
Yeah.
towards Jewar. So each city is trying to like offload their waste, but that becomes kind of like a never ending scenario.
I completely agree. And, first of all, you're right. I should have probably prefaced what I was going to say, saying that none of these Indian examples are perfect. So offloading the waste does not mean that now they are handling it efficiently, or whatever waste Delhi is handling it efficiently. I have, when you become a lawyer, you have to sell your soul a little to make ends meet. I have sold my soul appearing for waste companies and mining companies. I do that very often as well. And that is because all of our infrastructure is inadequate. There are technologies that are coming through that do not have the support of the policymakers due to obvious reasons. And I mean, like, Shubham, to answer your question, yes, everyone's offloading it to someone else, but the reason why they're offloading it is going back to the same question of the economics of it all. If you're able to, and usually this lecture of mine in the GPOTS fellowship is followed by a lecture on circular economy, where I integrate it into how this could be fixed. So yeah, anyway, that's, I'm sorry, it's not a convincing answer, but that's the reason why we're talking about it. If it had a clear answer, we probably won't be discussing it at all. Sorry, Satya, do you want to go?
Mine is more like a pessimistic mini rant, so I'd probably let Aishwarya go first, and I'd say what I want after that.
I'm always on board for pessimistic mini rants. My first book was a pessimistic mini rant. Aishwarya, you could go ahead.
Sir, Ishan. So I just wanted to bring you notice to the curious case of land costs in Allahabad, the district of Allahabad in UP. And so what exactly is, like, if you must be knowing, I'm not sure if you must be knowing, so the geography goes so that the main city region, the old city region of the city is basically, I mean, it's surrounded by Ganga and Yamuna, okay? And there are establishments, there are city establishments.
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what Allahabad is. I'm sorry, this is a recorded lecture. I would not acknowledge any such terms.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Prayagraj, indeed. Right. So the surrounded areas right outside the, like, if you cross the river,
I know, to the west of civil lines, yes.
Yeah, to the west of civil lines. So even the districts like the Nani and Phulpur, all these places are also decently populated, and they also have marketplaces and everything. The industry is also booming there, but people do not want to live there. So it's also like, and they just want to live within the confines of that, very same, I mean, the old city region.
Yeah.
And that has skyrocketed the rent prices and even the land prices by, let's say, so probably it's the costliest in the whole of UP, more costly than Noida, more costly than Ghaziabad, like per square feet, like the land area. So it just makes you wonder, like, even if even after people have places to reside right outside the city, and there is not much commute that's involved, and yet people do not want to live right outside. And it also has to do with the fact that people they just want to live there for the sake of maybe social acceptance or something, I'm not sure, but it just like renders a very peculiar insight into how the, like, the human settlements function. Just thought I would bring it to note.
No, I agree, Ashwarya. In fact, if you do read up on this, one of the most prominent, it's called the postal complex. That's why people don't want to move out of South Delhi to Gurgaon, Noida, or elsewhere, because they want the address of, say a deaf call or a new friends colony or whatever. Anyway, so my point there is that one of the most prominent schools of thought is that industrial and residential centers should always be away from each other. And that's not only from a waste management perspective more efficient, because for us, when we talk colloquially, we say, yeah, waste to itna bada issue, I don't know what to do about it, right? Or it's an IR issue now. But waste, it's like saying that my laptop's the best, right? That's a generic you don't know if it's a MacBook, you don't know if it's an HP, you don't know, I don't know if Compact is still in circulation or whatever the new brands are. It's the same as to do with waste, right? Industrial waste is different from biomedical waste, is different from plastic waste, is different from hazardous waste, is different from municipal solid waste, is different from e-waste, is different. I mean, I could go on and on and on. So the idea is, how do you formulate a policy in which, just by virtue of being a certain sector, you are segregating the waste right there and then, okay? But as you said, people do not want to, I mean, I cannot convince my father to come and stay with me in Delhi. So, I mean, if I cannot make that happen in my household, I don't know how you plan to change the society's perspective. But I agree. I mean, I'm actually surprised by Shubham's comment. He's saying that the land cost in Prayagraj, at least in parts of it, is comparable to that of Gurgaon. I'm actually very surprised about it.
So it's actually, I recently we sold off our ancestral property there, so I was able to make actual comparison between the prices there.
I'm sending you my Paytm number, Shubham, now. Anyway, but yeah, good point, Aishwarya. And there has to be a policy about decentralization. It goes back to Abhishek's point. What is the solution to it? I also don't want to elongate this too much, because one of my, and I said, like, I get drawn to this quicksand of environmental policy. But I teach a class in GPODs and at Jindal as well on the economics of intergenerational equity, which is, a principle. So let me also tell you, like, a good trick for anyone who's throwing words, environmental philosophy, policy words at you. Always remember, environmentalists are the most non-creative people ever. So if you don't know what that term means, just break it down. Precautionary principle is always going to be non-creatively precautionary principle. Polluter pays is going to be polluter who pays. Sustainable development would be development that is sustainable. Similarly, intergenerational equity is going to be equity that persists through generations. Okay. Now, when I do teach intergenerational equity, the question or the definition of intergenerational equity or sustainable development is that you leave enough resources for your future generations. Okay. That definition, internationally accepted definition, I argue, has a bit of a God complex to it. Because for you to allocate resources for future generations, you first have to know how many of the future generations, right? If the next generation is going to have 50 billion people, 10 billion people, 30 billion people, you don't know. And if you want to guess and then allocate, you're restricting their idea of procreation. So Amartya Sen says, have as many kids as you want. China says you have a one-child policy. You don't know what's going to happen. Policy intervention might happen, and you might end up having 3 billion as those, or Thanos might kick in and click his finger. You might end up having 3.5 billion people. And that means that you're inefficient in your resource allocation. The product inflow goes up, the supply chain goes down, affects the economy completely. The point I'm getting at is one of the most promising, perplexing theories is that of who decides the population when you're talking of resource allocation. And, if it is about decentralization, as Abhishek was saying, or as, I draw from Aishwarya's argument as well, maybe it is about having a two-front war of stabilizing your infrastructure and stabilizing your population. Now, how do you stabilize your population is the tricky bit, because we know we look down upon negative incentives. We know what Mrs. Gandhi did or what China did. And we also know what Norway is doing or what Sweden is doing and what Canada is doing with its PR scheme. So all of us, I know it is pronounced as Canada, I was just joking. So the point is that all of us have these population policies playing out in real life in front of us. But is that the stable solution? Is there political will to do it? All of those questions are policy questions, and I restrict myself to environmental policy. I'll let you be taking the call on that. Anyway, Satya, you had a point to make, and I hope that wasn't the point that you were making.
No, it wasn't. Maybe an add-on, but yeah. I'm essentially drawing back to your football field analysis and the quote which Aishwarya mentioned, but most of us had already had. So when we as humans talk about environmentalism, sustainability, blah, 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 we're talking about for our sustenance, right? You also mentioned environment predates us, environment will outlive us as well.
Yeah.
So when we worry about deforestation, we worry about the world going, all crashing down in flames.
I know where this is going.
Yeah, that's why I said it was a pessimistic mini rant, and I'm not trying to hide it. So I myself would like to consider myself a person who wants to work in the field of, say, environmental policy in the future and sustainability, blah, 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 all that. But at the same time, I do have the thoughts of thinking there isn't exactly a point anyway. It's all going to go crashing down. And worst case scenarios, we as a species will die. Some species will come in like 2 million years, 3 million years. We're just here for like a second, like a blade of grass, like you mentioned. So
absolutely.
Yeah, so that and your views on that, or no views also. So
no. So my view, and I completely agree, and it isn't you. I mean, like, please don't credit yourself to be very innovative in coming up with this idea that let's be all nihilistic about this. Because I'm reading Genealogy of Morals. I mentioned that earlier. I don't know if I did, or actually I've taken 3 lectures since morning, so I'm getting confused what I mentioned in this lecture or not. But I'm reading Genealogy of Morals, and it's about nihilism. It's completely Nietzsche and everything. So my point there is that your idea then would be, let's play along with this argument. And again, like my opinion is immaterial, it's inconsequential. It's your opinion and I do respect it. But let's play around with that idea that let's have an holistic outlook. It's going to be doomsday tomorrow, day after, or the week after eventually. So why care? The why care bit is because what will you do if it is going to be doomsday a week later? You'll spend all of your money. And obviously it won't be a week later, it'll be probably 100 years later. So you won't even have to suffer in terms of the money that you're spending. But the quality of life will go down. And this is where you have to draw a distinction between nihilism and individualism. Because you can be individually nihilistic, you cannot be communitarianly nihilistic. Why is that? Let's take the population policy as an example, the example that I was giving out, that we do not know how many resources we should account for because we don't know the population 50 years later. Let's say that we have figured out, and I think all of us do know, that population has some part to play in the environmental troubles or sustainability policies. Let's say that we all come to a conclusion that everyone in the world will have one child and no more. And I know that, you know, what happened with China's one child policy, sex ratio, black mark kids, everything kind of. But let's say, as a hypothetical situation, one child policy for all of the planet, okay? In your view, you would say that, you know, I don't need to have kids at all. I'm spending my money. I won't, my next generation would not survive anyway, right? That's one view to have. And we all come from a privileged background. I know some of us, there might be a difference of privileges, but this is all a privileged background. Go back to our example of one child global policy. A couple staying in Chittagong in Bangladesh is told that you're going to have one child and no more. And a couple staying in New York, Manhattan, you know, 103rd Street in Columbia, whatever. And they are told that you're going to have one child. the couple staying in Bangladesh, Chittagong, is obviously going to say that that couple who has 1,000 times the carbon footprint that I am, and I are being put through the same standard of policy just because you could not figure out a way. So while you might have an individualistic view, the communitarian view would not ever, or the environmental justice, the social justice view would never allow for giving up for towards or in favor of a doomsday scenario or an apocalypse scenario, because you always, that saying that a herd or a group is always as strong as the weakest member or whatever, and we always have to provide for our weak members. COVID is scary for you and me, not because we might contract it, because someone in our family who might be endangered more. And it's the same way how community works. You'll always care for the weakest person in the community. So I think axiologically, individualistically, or if you want to become a famous German philosopher who will be read by someone sitting in New Delhi 300 years later, you could adhere to that view. But I think practically, we'll always want to do better. I'm not sure, Abhishek. I'm not sure if it'll always be CBDR. There are a couple of new ideas that have come about. And again, like I have this different lecture altogether on carbon tax, cap and trade, whether there's a way forward. How do you include circularity into that whole thing? I think if I have to be absolutely honest, the way out is going to be circular economy, because it is also financially beneficial for each of us, fiscally profitable for all the companies. The transition to circular economy is going to be difficult. And I think and this is an article that I'm currently working on, so I don't want to give out too much to save plagiarism. But I think the biggest help in that transition is going to be reputational risk, because if today greenwashing is a thing, that means it pays to greenwash. That means there's a market that takes greenwashing on its face value, which means that there is someone who's concerned about something being green, which I know is a very crooked way to look at greenwashing, but at least if there's a market for it, that means that greenwashing sells, which means people appreciate greener initiatives. So maybe reputational risks is the way to go. There's Professor John Tobin of Cornell, who is a biodiversity economist, and he talks of reputational risks very prominently. So I invite you all to go through some of his work as well. Anyway, yeah, if any other questions remain, guys, I invite you to mail it directly to me. I'm going to put down my email ID again. I'm very, very annoyingly approachable sometimes. That's what my wife tells me. And please do feel free to reach out to me through the GPOD's website, through the email ID, through my LinkedIn, wherever.
Thank you, Ishan. I think on behalf of the entire class and like from all the faces that I can see, I feel like my classmates and I really enjoyed this session. And we'd just like to thank you, like on behalf of the MPPSC, the recruitment committee, and also the students, obviously, for taking time out and giving us this enriching and like a lecture which has a lot of strands, which I'm sure we'll like go back and think about, or at least like try to link it with whatever we are doing presently with our courses, because there is some amount of linkages, obviously. So yeah,
I'm glad. Thank you for the opportunity, Bala. And personally, and NVPOL always available for NLS. I have a couple of bones to pick for the past 1.5 decades. Happy to do that. And also separately happy to connect with all of you at any point of time. Please feel free to reach out to me with any ideas or critiques you might have. And let's carry the conversation forward. Let's not be nihilistic. Let's not adhere to Satya's viewpoints and look at the brighter future. Also look at it this way. I remember when I was completing my master's at Stanford, Stanford was going through a drought, California was going through a drought for about 25 years, and then it suddenly rained. And I went to one of my water law professors, and she told me that all of my job market is gone. So, आपदा को अवसर में बदलिए आप लोग, and make sure that whatever issues we faced with are also job opportunities for policy professionals. So a lot to look forward to.